so much, and thanks everyone for attending and for having me at this event. Israeli politics are my passion, so I'm always happy to talk about this topic. I'll just quickly say who I am and who Yachad are, even though I've had a lovely introduction from Dana. So as Dana said, I'm Scottish Israeli. That's the weird accent. I grew up in Israel and Scotland. My parents are kind of one of each. And I work for Yachad as their communications director, which mainly means that I annoy people on Twitter. Yachad are a British Jewish organization. Our primary mission is to empower British Jews in supporting political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're committed to supporting Israel's right to exist. We advocate for resolution to the conflict. We believe that only a political resolution will allow Israel to thrive alongside a viable Palestinian state. We exist as part of the mainstream Jewish community, although we offer challenge to much of the narrative that you often hear. We have thousands of supporters, a lot of young people work with and support us. We're members of the board of deputies, and we work closely with lots of different communal bodies. And we also work with a lot of partners in Israel who fight for human rights, equality, and democracy. So I'm sure you're all aware that Israel has an election coming up next Tuesday, November 1st. So that's what I'm here to speak about. This is our 5th election in 3 years. I often hear the phrase that means that Israel is kind of extra democratic, and I obviously completely reject that. Something has gone terribly wrong if we're having this many elections. Just briefly to kind of, I don't know how familiar people are with the Israeli election system, but Israel uses a proportional representation system called the list system. You cast your votes for a particular political party, not for a politician, and it's also not county or regional based. The number of seats that a party gets is in proportion to the number of votes. So there are 120 seats in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And so, for example, if you get 10% of the votes, you gain 12 seats, so on and so forth. There is a minimum threshold, which is 3.25%, which translates into 4 Knesset seats, and that's the minimum that you need in order to make it through to the Knesset. If you get less than 3.25% of the vote, then the votes essentially aren't counted, which is often an issue because a lot of small parties and individuals run in Israeli elections. I think our height was approximately 40 parties running a few years ago. Rarely more than about 15 make it into the Knesset. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of wasted votes. So in order to form a government, a cross-party coalition is needed of at least 61 MKs. The reason I say cross-party coalition is because there's never a single party government in Israel. The largest party in Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud, and he gets between 25 to 30% of the vote. There's never a party that will be able to form a government by itself without a coalition. The coalitions are usually formed of 6 to 8 to 10 parties. So 61 MKs, members of Knesset, 61 is your minimum that you need. And it's interesting because Netanyahu's current political campaign has very much been focused on getting 61 seats, which is a very tight minimum. The recent government tried to work with that and failed because it means that you just need one person to defect, one person to vote against you within your government, and you can't pass any laws. So it's quite challenging, very, very much a split political structure. And it's very kind of difficult to keep people united when you have that many parties to work with. I just want to talk briefly about the government from the past year, which a lot of people I know are interested in. So Israel's changed government was formed after the 2021 elections in March, after Netanyahu failed to form a government. So the largest party gets the first attempt to form a government. If they fail, it goes to the second largest party. So in this case, it went to Yachad, who formed a very, very diverse coalition with Naftali Bennett, who is a right-wing leader and a settler. The government in the past year has been formed of 8 political parties, including Ram, and our party. Again, very historic. We have never had an Arab party be part of the government. So definitely was a change government, though met by a lot of criticism from the right and the left. faced with a lot of challenge when you have that government that has right-wing, left-wing, centrist, and Arab parties. It's difficult to get people to agree, and also was met by a very, very strong opposition from the right wing who fought to topple the government. So after several defections from this changed government, including from the left, Meretz, and from Naftali Bennett's Yamina, the government wasn't able to pass any laws because it no longer held a majority, and the government collapsed. That meant that in June 2022, Naftali Bennett stood down. He's actually stood down from politics. He's not running for election this year, and his party is kind of dissolved. So as of June 2022, Yair Lapid has been prime minister. He is a centrist leader, though if you ask Netanyahu, he is a far left extremist, to give you an idea of how bad the rhetoric has gotten in Israel. So in terms of the change government, just quickly, from an Israeli perspective, from an Israeli secular perspective in particular, it has been a change government. There certainly has been progress on issues that a lot of liberal people would like to see, LGBT issues. There has been increased budgets given to Arab communities in Israel to tackle crime, to increase access to roads, to tackle unemployment, as well as other issues. From a Palestinian perspective, and I will caveat this, I'm not a Palestinian, so I can't speak on behalf of Palestinians, but from Palestinian perspective, as in Palestinians beyond the Green Line and in Jerusalem, the change government has not presented them with any change. We have seen continued settlement expansion, continued threat of evictions for Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. We have seen rounds of violence with Gaza, and currently heavy violence in the West Bank, which some say may lead to third intifada. So from a Palestinian perspective, it's not a changed government. From an Israeli perspective, it kind of depends on who you ask, because from a kind of, again, liberal perspective, there certainly has been change. But from the right wing and Netanyahu perspective, there's been a very populist anti-change campaign, which kind of presents the past year as a threat to Israel as a Jewish nation. Heavy attacks on the presence of Muslims in the government, very racist, very populist rhetoric from Netanyahu. Much of it's based on mistruths and lies about how much budget has gone. You'll often hear the line that money has gone to the Muslim Brotherhood. That's a very common campaign line from Benjamin Netanyahu. That's obviously not true. But there's been a huge attack on the fact that there's been a Palestinian or Arab presence in the current government, and also just kind of against progress in general. So in terms of the upcoming elections, I'm not going to go into every single party in great detail, but I kind of wanted to talk about who the main players are. I would urge you not to look at Israeli politics from an overly British perspective, and to try and understand that this context in Israel is incredibly different. And it's not, I wouldn't put an overly Western lens on the issues here. It's not your standard left-wing, right-wing parties. There are issues that the UK doesn't see in terms of the impact of faith, especially with very religious Haredi, which is very, very religious, very orthodox conservative groups. We have issues around not just, I think often Israel is described as kind of Israel-Palestine, and that's the two competing sides and narratives we see, but actually within Israel, there are a lot of divisions from different communities. We have Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, Ashkenazi being European origin Jews, and Mizrahi being Middle Eastern origin Jews. There are still remaining tensions, which are often used by populist leaders between those groups. Jews from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopian Jews. There are tensions between secular and conservative religious people, and how that impacts daily life, from everything from education to public transport to budgets. So I think that's really important to keep in mind when you look at Israel, as well as the security issues. So Israeli politicians don't talk about the occupation; they talk about security issues. But there is a real experienced trauma that Israelis have experienced from war, from military service, from violence, from intifada, whatever else. And so those experiences and narratives make the political system and the political campaigning very, very different. And I just think to kind of keep that in mind. So can't not talk about Benjamin Netanyahu, unfortunately. So Benjamin Netanyahu leads the Likud, which is a right-wing party. It is the biggest party in Israel, and it will remain the biggest party in Israel for the foreseeable. polling at approximately 27%. He has a very strong supporter base. I will say, and it's not my area of expertise at all, so I can't really take questions on it, but Netanyahu continues to face corruption charges and his trials are ongoing. But his supporter base is very, very strong. There's very much a cult of personality around Benjamin Netanyahu. He is a very clever politician who has managed to manipulate the political system in different ways over the years in order to remain in power. And his fight is certainly a fight to remain in power, with using the Israeli population's fear against them. It's particular fear of Muslims, fear of Palestinians, fear of change, and that really has been the rhetoric. His campaign has focused on calling for his existing supporters, for encouraging people who are non-voters to vote. In the past, he's attacked and the threat of Arabs voting. He's chosen not to take that tactic yet this year. He's actually claimed that he has an Arab supporter base and has called on them to vote, while at the same time very much again attacking Lapid and the current government for having supported the Muslim Brotherhood, which again they obviously haven't, and for relying on support from Palestinian and Arab MKs, which they deem to be connected to terror, again in the right wing. Also, Benjamin Netanyahu was very much, as populists do, attack the media and paints kind of anything that is not right wing as an enemy to Jewishness. And I'm not even talking about the Palestinians or the left abroad. I'm talking about internal tensions. And then we have, I'm just going to talk about the right wing before I go into, I'll try and end on a slightly more hopeful note. The third, and this is what our biggest concern is really, the third biggest party polling in Israel is Religious Zionist Party. So the Religious Zionist Party is a far-right party. It's a coalition of three smaller parties. It's polling at approximately 11 or 12%. It's led by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. It's a party that is defined by Jew supremacy, by anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian sentiment, completely opposes not only Palestinian statehood, but rights and equality for Palestinians. It's also the party, another third element of the party is Noam, which is a small section, but it's an anti-LGBT party. They've certainly been gaining traction, particularly due to Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I'm sure that you've heard of, who is kind of a monster created by Bibi. It's important to note the Religious Zionist Party, because it used to be three smaller parties, had very little political power. This union came together and has been held together by Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think it's starting to get out of his control because he is going to lose votes to the far right. But there we have it. We've seen Itamar Ben-Gvir be an active threat to other Jews. He often appears in areas of conflict and violence. Just a couple of weeks ago, he appeared in Sheikh Jarrah, pulled out a gun, causes a huge frustration often to the military and to the police even, shows up in illegal settlements and outposts and supports violent settlers. And also part of his campaign, and you see these posters in Israel from him, part of his campaign is also to kind of, he claims that he wants to deport Israel's enemies to Syria. It's always Syria, it's his country of choice for where he wants to deport people to. I don't think it's actually something that is going to happen, but I do think that the populist and level of populist rhetoric is, we haven't seen that since probably Yitzhak Rabin's time. And what is most concerning is that should Netanyahu be able to form a government, which is not an unlikely outcome, he has allegedly guaranteed ministerial positions both to Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, which means that they will have positions of power. And the far right holding power is of concern to all of us. Just from a Jewish communal point of view, you might remember that Smotrich came to visit the UK earlier this year. I'm losing track of time. And the Board of Deputies of British Jews put out a very, very strong condemnation and distanced themselves from Smotrich. And so I think that from a British Jewish communal point of view, we're going to be faced with a massive challenge of how our community ties itself to Israel and kind of will continue to support Israel, but with a very far right government that threatens Israeli democracy. And much of the battle I think you see in Israel is a tension between Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state, and which of those words comes first? Because for the far right, Jewish comes before democratic, and obviously to me that's a threat to democracy and equality. And then the other right-wing parties you have are the kind of more religious conservative parties. Again, this is why I say that the left-wing, right-wing lens can sometimes be difficult because they are socially conservative, but economically often quite socialist. Their communities are very poor, and they kind of support socialist policies to help Haredi communities. So that's the kind of broad right-wing possibilities. And then the other is the current coalition led by Yair Lapid, who's a centrist in many terms, kind of relatively left-wing for in Israeli political terms. He's polling at around 20%. He's not doing too badly. And he is the only serious opposition to Netanyahu. He's the only one who leads a serious threat to Netanyahu, and we could certainly recognize that. And he leans on left-wing parties and centrist parties, but he also is most likely to need to lean on either one of the Arab parties, which is also the biggest campaign against him. So it's quite difficult. In terms of Israel-Palestine, he recently declared at the UN, again, I'm sure you've heard, support for a two-state solution, which I think might sound very vanilla to people abroad, but from considering how toxic the rhetoric is in this country on that issue, for him to, during an election time, declare that he supports a Palestinian state is quite major. He also has worked very hard prior to these elections to broker a maritime agreement with Lebanon. Some people try to play it down, but again, I think there's a conscious attempt from him to also appeal to Arab and Palestinian voters. And I'll maybe just end on that. And again, I'll say I'm not Palestinian. I can't speak on behalf of Palestinians, but it's a question that's come up quite often. And as Yachad, we also work with a lot of MPs, and it's something that people are interested in. Arab Israelis / Palestinian citizens of Israel are not a singular entity. Not all Muslim, not all Christian. There are Druze and Bedouin, and those who identify as Arab, those who identify as Palestinian. There isn't one party that represents them. They don't only define themselves by the Palestinian issues. The biggest within the Green Line, the biggest issue really facing Arabs in Israel is crime, violent crime, which particularly has affected women. That has been on the rise for the past few years. I do think there's a positive in the fact that they have had representation in this government and a budget to tackle that, but I guess time will tell. But so far there's been little progress on that issue. In terms of the election, there's according to journalists, Arab and Palestinian journalists, there's kind of a dismay and likely to see a low turnout. I think part of Lapid's attempt to deal with the Lebanese issue and declare support for two states has also been to try and appeal to Palestinian Arab voters. Whether or not that's going to work, I'm doubtful, because as I said before, from the Palestinian perspective, or those who kind of vote on the basis of that, this change government has not offered them change, and actually in some ways has made things worse and kind of entrenched the status quo. It is worth noting that it's not a single Palestinian voice. It's not just Ram that has been in the government. There have also been Arab and Palestinian MKs in the Labour Party and in Meretz. Isawi Frij, and we did an event with a while ago. He was the first ever Arab minister to be in the Israeli government. He's actually taken a step back from politics and focusing on Israeli communities, and Arab communities in Israel. We've also had Ibtissim Ra'anana, who's from Labour, who's worked very hard to try and fight for LGBTQ rights for Arab communities. So it has been more of an issue, but it's kind of so incredibly toxic at the same time. Again, in terms of campaigns, I think Merav Michaeli seems to be making a very strong effort. Merav Michaeli leads the Labour Party. She has been doing a lot of campaigning in Arabic, which not a lot of Jewish Israeli leaders do. And also I'll give a shout out to Standing Together, who are one of our partners in Israel, and they've been doing a massive campaign to tackle actually joint issues, which isn't something you see very often. We talk about the Arabs, and we talk about the Jews, and we talk about Israelis and Palestinians, and Standing Together kind of talk about the issues that affect everyone together, poverty and unemployment, public transport and education and so forth. And they've been trying to get people to vote on that basis. And then last but not least, I will just caveat that because one of the communities most affected by the government is Palestinians in East Jerusalem who do not have the right to vote in national elections, even though East Jerusalem is annexed. And so the Israeli government completely impacts the life and threat of evictions, etc., for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. So those are kind of the main topics. I don't know if now maybe is a good time to open to questions, because I've seen the chat box popping up. I'm not voting. I'm not betting on one side or the other and what's going to happen. I really don't know. And as I said, that the government is likely to be based on a difference of 1 MK. People are trying to get 61 out of 120 in order to form a government, which is a very, very narrow amount. So even though polling suggests Netanyahu is most likely and he will get the first go at forming a government, it's so narrow that it only takes a small percentage of votes to shift that.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Just so much more clear now, because it has been quite confusing for some of us trying to follow from overseas in particular. So I've actually got a really good question from Brian Chapman on that. What is the most balanced source of coverage of Israeli politics online?
Very good question. Me. No, so first of all, we do actually, like, self-promotion, but Yachad do create resources on Instagram, on our website, and on Twitter, where we try and put out balanced resources. I mean, we're obviously a left-leaning organization, and so that is a caveat, but we try and reflect the Israeli perspective on things. I would also follow Israeli press. The reason Twitter is good is because you do have the translate button. So, I mean, Israeli sources like Haaretz, Israeli News has an English version of the newspaper. I tend to say also, don't just read left-wing sources if you want to really get an understanding of where people are coming from. Again, these are from an Israeli perspective rather than from a Palestinian perspective. I can kind of come up with a list if you want to circulate after the event, if that's helpful.
That's perfect. This event is recorded and we will be putting it up on the website in the events past recording section. And so if you send me any kind of resources, I popped the Yachad website in the chat box, but if you send me any resources, I'll put them on that page as well, so that people can have some room to go and do some deep dives and follow themselves. So we've got loads of questions coming in, as you can see. From Magan Singodia, Balfour Project trustee, how is it possible for someone to stand for Prime Minister if a person is under criminal investigation?
Very simple, there's not a law to prevent it. There has been an attempt or suggestion of passing that law in the Knesset to prevent anyone under criminal investigation from standing. It's cause of Bibi's support base, very, very difficult. And so it's not something that the government managed to pass. It came up a few times. There's just simply, there's no law to prevent it. And not only that, Netanyahu and Smotrich have suggested that they will pass a law essentially doing the opposite, that don't prevent people from running. So you've got a man in power very much trying to protect himself, but there's no law to stop it at the moment.
Do you think they just thought it was obvious that you shouldn't if you're under investigation, so they didn't bother putting it in, and now they're kicking themselves?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, because someone asked me about this a couple of days ago, is why is Lapid not actually going stronger on the issue of corruption? And I think some voters are actually a little bit exhausted of that narrative, and people are looking for something hopeful rather than just hearing about how dangerous Bibi is, and that's also feedback from a lot of Arab voters as well.
I have a question. Well, actually, there's a few questions. So there's a lot of talk about Liz Truss's review of the UK embassy and potentially moving it to Jerusalem. How much coverage did that get in Israel? Yeah, how was that related to the election, if at all?
Very good question. So first of all, we campaigned against it and opposed it. We had hundreds of British Jews speak out against that move. Jerusalem is a tinderbox, and any move like that can really cause an uptake in violence, and is a danger to entrenching the status quo, but also making things worse. Jerusalem doesn't need an excuse for violence to erupt. It's always a city on edge. So interestingly, and I've spoken to friends about this, Israeli friends, it simply wasn't an issue in Israel. It got a couple of articles and stuff, but it just hasn't come up. It's not part of the discussion. I follow kind of politics, Israeli politics online, and I try and follow a broad amount of sources that are right-wing too. If you were to ask, Israelis consider Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel, and if you were to ask Israelis, they wouldn't have a problem with it. They're not interested in it. They're not asking for it. It's not part of anyone's campaigns. It's not really a topic of discussion here.
Weird that she wanted to die on that hill then.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I've got a question from Ronald Mendel. What is the relationship between the upcoming elections and the crackdown on Palestinian unrest and the turbulence that we've seen in the last couple of days in the West Bank?
I'll be completely honest. I'm not sure that the timing is linked. I think things have been heating up for a while now. I think it's the result of a status quo that hasn't changed and very little attempt to change it. I've not over the past 2 weeks too closely monitored the security point of view of it, but we know that there have been groups that are not linked to Hamas or to Fatah that are separate groups that actually, it sounds like Palestinian leadership are really struggling themselves to control. And interestingly, those groups also are very young. They're not people who necessarily have memories of the last Intifada even. And so it seems like it's kind of locally going out of hand as well. I will say that I think that, and in particular, Benny Gantz, who is the defense minister, I think he is really keen to prove himself as kind of a strong military man, which for him is part of his campaign. And I think there is a desire, because the feedback from the opposition and from Bibi is that this government is dangerous in terms of how closely it might work with the Palestinians. I think there is a desire to prove itself to be very, very firm on security. And so that probably does play a part of it. I think it certainly played a part of the strategy in dealing with the round of rockets in August. So I do think there's a desire to prove itself. The government wants to prove itself as being strong on security, as they would say, and so the response might be a little bit more firm, and therefore making things worse. I was at the newspaper I put in the chat. They held a conference just a couple of days ago on elections, and Lapid spoke and Gantz spoke, etc. So it was like cross-party. And there's I can't remember her name, but a security expert actually spoke, and her view was the way that things are going in the West Bank. She thought that if there is, she's not a left-wing person, she's a security person, former MK for Israel Beitenu, which is a right-wing party. Her view is that a far-right government with Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and so on will be the cause of a third intifada, which is terrifying. So yeah.
Yeah, terrifying for everyone involved. So just so many good questions coming in on that note. From Andy Dare, I'm really sorry. One day I will find out how to say your name, because you always ask such interesting questions. Are security issues, the Palestine problem, the main issue in the elections? And is the left-right distinction in Israeli politics based on how hard someone professes to be with the Palestinians? Or is there a normal left-right split in Israel?
Very good question. So the security issue, yes, it's always going to be part of the main Israeli rhetoric, except for the people really on the left who are very kind of anti-occupation and talk about peace and kind of want to support us. And especially when you see rounds of violence, even the people who are more two-state solution-y are likely to be very security focused. I think that's also, and this is where I say be a little bit forgiving to Israeli populations, that's a natural reaction to trauma. If you see, like in May, we had a round of violence where there were shootings in like the streets of Israel. The cafe bar was shot in Tel Aviv, and a couple of buses were shot at. And people's natural reaction is to be defensive and to want to protect their families, and so that does push people to the right. So yes, security issues are a main issue, more so than two-state solutions, although I do see an increase in rhetoric from Lapid around two-state solutions and talking about the Palestinians. Gantz doesn't do that so much. He's more focused on defense and security. Labor and Meretz will talk about two-state solution. Merav Michaeli is very strong about talking about going back to the Rabin way, which is negotiating with Palestinians. So Labor and Meretz are very much of the belief that there is a partner to negotiate with. And I think Lapid is on that belief as well, but he knows that talking about it too much is probably not going to do him any favors. However, the day-to-day life of Israelis is affected by exactly the same issues as kind of others. Cost of living is a huge concern for people, especially the cost of rent and housing. Again, public transport. And also a lot of people in the center are concerned about the growing very religious populations, the Haredi groups, and the amount of budgets that those communities get. So for example, most of Israel doesn't have public transport on a Saturday because of the influence of religious leaders. And so that growing influence of the failure to separate church and state or synagogue and state is also of a concern. So yes, security is a big issue, but Israelis do have other day-to-day concerns.
Thanks for that. I've got a question from Derek Payne. Israel seems to be tying itself in knots over Ukraine. Is this an electoral issue?
I don't think it's an electoral issue as much as it's a let's avoid it in the election issue. I don't know if you saw Netanyahu being interviewed on the MSNBC, where he was asked on Ukraine and then his mic suddenly dropped. He doesn't want to touch it. Just last year, his campaign posters had Putin on them. And so you very much know where the right wing stand on this issue. Lapid has been more, and this government has been more supportive of the Ukrainians, but they're definitely struggling with it. Is it a huge campaign issue? Not massively. Again, more so weaponized by Netanyahu saying the kind of every now and then threat, but he doesn't really want to tie himself to one side on this either. So it's not massive. Although there were a lot of Israeli community protests in support of Ukraine, especially seeing as we have a large population of former USSR Jewish immigrants. So,
thank you. Right, we've got a question from Richard Burden, our new trustee at the Balfour Project, former MP up north. Sorry, Richard. How can the left and peace camp in Israel balance potentially joining a new coalition to keep Lapid in office as the lesser of two evils against maintaining their independence in opposition to try to build support for more progressive politics in opposition to occupation, even if from a very low base?
Again, yeah, good question. Listen, the left have been in opposition for a very long time in Israel. It hasn't really gotten very far. And so I think, unfortunately, they trying to seek power if and where they can, and joining a coalition, you might call it lesser of two evils. To me, it's a very much lesser evil. Again, Palestinians will see that differently. But it's not just about opposing occupation. It really is about fighting for democracy here. I mean, we are facing the threat of the second biggest party under Netanyahu is a party that is led by a man that called LGBT people beasts. It's led by people who want to literally send our enemies abroad. It's really, really scary language. And so I think, whilst I think it's a huge challenge for Meretz to sit in a government where they can't really do that much on occupation, they have to play politics better, of course, and fight with the power that they do have. But sitting in opposition isn't going to get them anywhere. It is better to be part of a coalition where there can be small changes. And while the changes have been small, a Lapid government that speaks about a two-state solution as opposed to exiling Palestinians, and again, Ben-Gvir, who wants to be Minister of Interior, Minister of Security, wants to be Minister of everything, but Ben-Gvir has said he doesn't only not support a Palestinian state, he doesn't support Palestinian rights, he doesn't believe that Palestinians should be citizens, he doesn't believe they have the right to vote, he believes in one state where Palestinians are not equal. So I think that, again, the lesser of two evils, one of those evils is quite a major evil. And so Meretz and Labour have to do all they can to get power, but also to gain traction and get people to vote on the day-to-day issues they care about.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just blasting you with questions now.
That's
because
fine.
we've had
Go
so
for it.
many come through, and
Go for it.
it's super exciting to be able to get through all of them. That kind of segues nicely into Mike Curtis's question. Is there much debate in the elections about one or two states, or indeed any practical solution to the problems of Palestine?
So I try and track as many Israeli news channels as I can. It's really not a part of the mainstream debate. Again, we talk about security. It's interesting that actually Lapid is the one that put it on the table, and more than Meretz have managed to. Meretz talking about two-state solution isn't going to get as much attention as Lapid doing so. So in terms of practical solutions, again, there's a speech made by Lapid last year when he was foreign minister, where he actually suggested an alternative approach to Gaza, which is strengthening the Palestinian Authority and working with the Palestinian Authority through partners in Egypt and so on, in order to weaken Hamas, which is the opposite of the EU's approach, which has been to strengthen Hamas in order to weaken the Palestinian Authority. And so his view was kind of working with the Palestinian Authority and strengthening and human rights in Gaza in order to build a more stable Palestinian path to statehood. So there have been some solutions spoken about, but it's not a day-to-day rhetoric. Like that is not the main issue of the election.
So interesting, isn't it? I have got a question from Jean Fitzpatrick. Where would you say Biden's administration stands on the election? To further expand on that, where do you think the Americans, what outcome do you think they're hoping for?
I mean, obviously, this is very much my bet, because they're going to support whoever, like the Americans are not going to take a side. I mean, obviously, I think the Americans would much rather under Biden see a Lapid government, which is easier for them to work with, easier for them to influence, than to see a government have to tackle their partnership with Israel. For the Americans to have to continue to maintain a strong partnership with Israel, with having Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as ministers and having the return of Netanyahu, is a massive challenge that I reckon they don't want in their hands. So I think they're very much hoping for some way of Lapid forming a government.
Thanks for that. All right, so another name I'm probably going to pronounce wrong. Tim Livesey, I'm going to go for. Does the relative instability of Israeli politics and successive governments help the more extreme or fringe parties and groupings, as opposed to the more centrist positions? And how does settler movements fit into this?
Very good question. So on the first one, yes, instability always helps populists. People feel when things are unstable, especially in a country like this, where so often you do see violence and conflict, and the cost of living, which affects everyone, and rising levels of poverty, that is always going to play into the hands of populists. And we've seen the rise of Itamar Ben-Gvir, again, which I credit to Netanyahu. And his focus has really been on young men, and promoting voting amongst young men, and also young Haredi men who don't tend to vote necessarily, or don't tend to get very political. And so he certainly uses uncertainty and constant change to do that, and as has Bibi. In terms of the settlements, also that is an audience that belongs to the right wing. I should say that settlers are kind of 80-20, 80% are economic settlers. They might believe in settlements, but they're settled for economic reasons. And around 20% of the settlement movement is a religious, political movement, including the hilltop youth, including settlers in places like Hebron, including violent settlers. And those settlers are incredibly empowered by the right wing. We have, I've forgotten her name, Brooke, who is an MK for Religious Zionist Party, who lives in Hebron. Ben-Gvir again is near Hebron, and they empower the settlement movement, and they say, you know, if you leave Tel Aviv, you'll see parties, political parties for everyone, kind of everywhere. But the minute you go into settlements, you see more and more right-wing posters, and the campaign is clearly focused on settlements. And you have seen the presence of people like Brooke and Ben-Gvir and others they enter the settlements and they support the settlements and the settlers who are often violent, again, even soldiers. They refuse to condemn often settler violence. So there certainly is, that is certainly a voting ground that strengthens the far right.
Thank you. I'm sorry, there are just so many questions, and I agree, they're also fascinating. The amount of different topics they're covering. Like I said, I'm trying to pick questions on each themes because there's just no way that we'll be able to get through every single question because there have been so many coming through. I also want to remind people that Danielle, because she's focusing on presenting and answering questions, she's not looking at the chat box herself, but I will be sharing the chat box with her after the event. So please do drop any comments in there or any questions you'd like her to see, even if we don't get around to reading them out. So I am going to ask a question from Cheryl Kipping. To what extent can/do Jewish people living outside of Israel vote in the elections? So I presume Israeli citizens living outside of Israel vote in the elections, or is it only for people currently living in Israel?
So easy one. So if you're Jewish, you can't vote, but if you have to be an Israeli citizen. You don't have to be a resident, but you have to be in Israel. So you can't vote from abroad unless you're like an embassy employee or you're on a diplomatic mission or something like that. But if you're an Israeli living in London, unless you fly to Israel, you can't vote.
So interesting, because I'm half Palestinian, half Belgian, and even living abroad outside of Belgium, I'm obliged to vote.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, crazy, right? So they're very protective about their right to vote. So it's basically the law. I don't know what happens if you don't. They're Belgians. I can't imagine they get to.
Yeah, so I used to, like I said, I used to work with the Israeli community, and so I've looked into it a little bit, and so there's no clear stats on how it would impact voting, and so I don't think there's any particular side or party that pushes for. It's come up as a there's been an attempted law change a couple of times, but I don't think there's a party or side that cares enough because they don't know how it's going to
benefit
affect.
Either way, really,
Yeah.
or they don't know how they will. Yeah. Until someone makes it their mission, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got from Ian Drummond, is there a chance of another is there a chance of another coalition between Lapid and elements of the far right, as with Bennett last time, or is the right united now around Netanyahu despite his legal issues?
So Bennett's party has, like I said, dissolved. I wouldn't class again within the Israeli spectrum. Bennett is far right, maybe Yachad would be, but so Bennett stepped down. His party's kind of dissolved. So that party is not really in the game. Ayelet Yachad, like I said, who's very right wing, was Minister of Interior, is trying to run. She's not likely to pass the threshold. Even though she used to be a promising politician. I do not see any possibility of Lapid forming a government with Smotrich and so on. The only possibility from a right-wing party would be something like United Torah Judaism, which is a Haredi party, which isn't as like far right. Again, like I said, a lot of their politics are about their local communities. And so that's the kind of only possibility, but Lapid isn't going to work with Bibi, Lapid isn't going to work with Smotrich. If I had to put money on it, obviously.
Who knows what will happen? Stranger things have happened, haven't they? So we've got a question. We've had a few different people asking this question in various ways, but does Netanyahu have a successor lined up? It's a problem we have in the Palestinian world as well.
He doesn't, and I don't think that's by accident. So it's interesting if you look at the Likud, many of his ministers or likely to be ministers and people who he surrounded himself with are very different to him in the way that they behave. They're much more kind of shouty and presented in a way that just doesn't make them seem like legitimate successors. He had one person who tried to run against him in the primaries, Yuli Edelstein, who's a little bit more, he's not as, I don't know, maybe not as bad as Netanyahu in some ways. He quickly stepped down. The Likud's base is so reliant on and leans on Netanyahu. There's no clear successor. Again, there's a couple of people that have hinted that they might do it, but the only way would be if Netanyahu decided to step down, or if the Likud were to split in some way.
Right, yeah. I thought you would say something along those lines. We have an event coming up on the 17th of November. I just want to take an opportunity to mention it. It's with Ramzi Baroud. He is an amazing writer, journalist, and it is on impunity and exceptionalism. Will Israel be held accountable to international law? He will be talking about it from a UK perspective and also drawing parallels with the Ukraine-Russia situation. So it's going to be very, very interesting. Please do come along. I posted a link in the chat box if you want to register. It's Thursday, 17th of November at 3 p.m. UK time. We will be recording it and putting it on our website as well, same as with this event. Right, so next question. From Sami Stein, what do you think will be the impact of Lapid's statement that his government supports a two-state solution and the recent agreement with Lebanon on the gas fields?
So from my point of view, hopefully positive. I think that I actually, and again, taking into account the Israeli context is very different to British context, it was actually quite a brave statement in this timing. I think it's an attempt to, rather than just campaign based on fear, which is what the right wing have been doing, it's a campaign trying to be based on hope and a better future. And we haven't really seen that in some time, certainly not in recent years. So hopefully it's positive. That coupled with the Lebanon agreement, his aim is obviously that it's going to be positive. Again, some have said that it's trying to encourage more Palestinians and Arab citizens to vote for him. Whether or not that'll happen, I don't know, but hopefully it's positive. And also on a global stage, it's put him in a kind of better position for many. So I think people recognize that he's a more palatable leader for people globally.
Thanks for that. I have just popped some links in the chat box. As you know, we host these monthly webinars for free. We've been doing it since April 2020. We've decided to carry on with them past the pandemic and all the lockdowns because they're still so very well attended. And then we put the recordings of most of them on the website that are viewed hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times sometimes. So if you would like to help support our work, I've popped some links in the chat box. You can make a one-off donation if you can spare the cost of a coffee, for example. It's all blurred, probably for the best. Other coffees are available. And if you want to sign up as a friend of the Balfour Project, that would be absolutely amazing. We started off in friends benefits. So for example, you get access to some of our screenings for free. We've recently had Boycott by Just Vision and Julia Basha, the director, followed by Q&A with her. And also we've had in the past the Gatekeepers and Human Factor directed by Dror Moray. So we will also be offering opportunities for friends to talk with the trustees directly and so forth. So do have a look at that. We would really appreciate any support. I've also just seen that Danielle has shared the Twitter and the Yachad Twitter and her Twitter in the chat box. So do follow them. They're a fantastic resource, very interesting. And yeah, again, I've posted the upcoming event. If you can't click through the links, I know sometimes in the chat box, the links aren't clickable. I don't know why, but you can find all of the information on the Balfour Project website, upcoming events or recorded events, past recordings. And in there, we will have a page dedicated to this event where we will put up all the resources that we've shared. So do check that out, and please do share this as well with anyone that you think might be interested that hasn't been able to join us live. So I'm going to end on a question. I try to end on a hopeful note, but I really don't know what the answer is to this one. So, but it's from Michael Vince. Given the ecological damage to the environment, we've had an event on this in the past, Abbas Milhelm, so do check that out. Given the ecological damage to the environment, are any parties talking about climate change?
Yes. Climate change is not my field at all. Obviously, I kind of share the concern. It's not my field at all. Yeah, certainly, again, you're more likely to see it from centrist parties. But actually, Naftali Bennett was supportive for COP26, and there was representative cross-party at COP26. You're more likely to see that those concerns raised from the center and from the left. So yeah, it is a discussion. Again, I would say it's not as central to the day-to-day debate, but in the good sense of hope, we have seen that it's a debate that young people have been very involved in Israel. From what I've seen, there have been protests and so on from young people. So I think in line with the kind of global movement, young people seem to have been leading, maybe not quite as much as they have on things like LGBT issues and equality for women. I think that's probably, those are more hot topics, but yeah, there has been some.
We'll call that a neutral note to end on.
Yeah, sorry, it's really not my my topic of expertise.
No, that's fine. So yeah, so November 1st, isn't it, the elections?
November 1st is our election. Yachad have a post-election event. We're about to share it on Twitter. I can't share it yet. It's not out yet. With Noah Landau from Haaretz, an Israeli journalist.
Is that an online event that people can join?
It will be hybrid. So yeah, we'll have in person and online. Please don't ask me to predict the outcome of the election. And it's also very possible that by November 2nd, we won't know. Last time we didn't know by the second day what would happen. Obviously, one side kind of has to give a chance to form a government, and if they fail, then the other side does. And if both fail, then we have a sixth election in 3 years, which is also not an unlikely outcome.
Yeah, that's cuckoo bananas. I'm not gonna lie. But thank you. You've clarified it so much. Again, even for people that are trying to follow this issue from outside of Israel, it has been quite complicated and confusing, and you've just made it make a lot more sense. So I really, really appreciate that. I feel like I feel much more informed going into watching this upcoming election. As I mentioned, Danielle hasn't been looking at the chat box, but I'm going to be sharing it with her. So do drop any comments. I think you all agree she's been fantastic. It's been super interesting to listen to you. So again, share this event with anyone that you think will be interested. The recording will be up hopefully within a couple of hours. It depends how long it takes for Zoom to process the recording. So yeah, share it, follow Yachad for interesting updates. And thank you very much, Danielle, for speaking to us all. And thank you, audience. You've been fantastic as always with your many brilliant questions. And again, apologies, I haven't had a chance to get through even half of them. We just couldn't. So thank you so much. And
thank you for having me.
No, thank you. And have a lovely rest of the day, evening, wherever you are. And we'll see you next time. Bye.